It is evening in Riyadh, and a city that barely had public entertainment a decade ago is now lit up with concert venues, a Formula E race circuit, and restaurant terraces packed with families who would have had almost none of this to do after dark just a few years earlier. A few hundred kilometers away in the desert near the Red Sea coast, cranes are working around the clock on a construction project so ambitious that most engineers outside the country still aren't sure exactly how it will be finished. This is Saudi Arabia in 2026, and it looks almost nothing like the country most people still picture in their heads. Most of what people think they know fits on a bumper sticker. Oil, desert, strict rules, Mecca. All of that has some truth in it. None of it is the whole story anymore, and large parts of it are already out of date. Start with the map. Saudi Arabia occupies most of the Arabian Peninsula, bordered by Jordan and Iraq to the north, the Persian Gulf and Qatar, Bahrain and the UAE to the east, Oman and Yemen to the south, and the Red Sea to the west. It is enormous, roughly the size of Western Europe, and yet the vast majority of that land is desert, with the population concentrated into a handful of major cities. Riyadh, the capital, sitting in the center of the country, Jeddah, the commercial gateway on the Red Sea coast, and Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities in Islam, drawing pilgrims from every corner of the globe. The population today sits at roughly 37 million people, and here is the number that surprises most outsiders. Close to 13 million of those residents, well over a third, are foreign nationals drawn from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Egypt, the Philippines, and dozens of other countries, working across construction, healthcare, domestic labor, and increasingly, under Vision 2030 in finance, technology, and tourism as well. The country is administratively split into 13 regions, each with its own distinct character. The eastern province along the Persian Gulf coast is where the oil industry is headquartered and where Aramco's operations are concentrated. The western Hejaz region holds Mecca, Medina, and Jeddah, historically the peninsula's most cosmopolitan corridor, thanks to centuries of pilgrim traffic passing through. The central Najd region, home to Riyadh, was historically more isolated and conservative, and it's no coincidence that the modern Saudi state itself grew out of Najdi tribal politics rather than the more outward-facing coastal regions. The question was never really whether Saudi Arabia is wealthy or influential. The question is how a country this large, this young, nearly two-thirds of the population is under 35, and this suddenly open is trying to reinvent itself before the oil runs out. Now, the part almost no visitor expects. Long before oil, the Arabian Peninsula was a crossroads of ancient trade routes, carrying frankincense, myrrh, and spices between the Indian Ocean, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. Nomadic Bedouin tribes moved across the interior for thousands of years, developing a code of hospitality, poetry, and tribal governance that still shapes Saudi social values today, long after the tents have mostly been replaced by cities. Then in the early 7th century, everything changed. The Prophet Muhammad was born in Mecca, and Islam emerged from that city in nearby Medina, spreading within a single century across an empire stretching from Spain to Central Asia. Mecca and Medina have remained the two holiest sites in Islam ever since, and the ruler of Saudi Arabia today carries an official title tied directly to that legacy, custodian of the two holy mosques. Hold on to that timeline. We will get there. But look closer at what happened to the peninsula in the centuries between that early Islamic explosion and the modern state, because it was anything but a straight line. For most of the following 13 centuries, the Arabian interior fragmented into competing tribal confederations, oasis towns, and short-lived local dynasties, largely outside the direct control of the various caliphates and empires that rose and fell around it. The Ottoman Empire held nominal authority over parts of the peninsula, particularly the Hejaz coast, but the deep interior remained a patchwork of tribal rule for centuries. The same fragmented landscape that a young leader named Abdulaziz ibn Saud would spend the early 20th century stitching back together by force, alliance, and religious legitimacy. Here's a fact that says more about modern Saudi Arabia than almost anything else. The country as it exists today is young, founded in 1932, when Abdulaziz ibn Saud completed a decades-long campaign to unify a patchwork of rival tribal territories and kingdoms across the peninsula into a single state, naming it after his own family. That act of unification is barely a century old, younger than plenty of familiar international brands. Just 6 years later, in 1938, oil was discovered near Dhahran in the country's eastern province. Development ramped up through the following decades, and the state oil company that grew out of that discovery, Saudi Aramco, became the largest oil company on Earth, sitting atop reserves that reshaped the global economy for the rest of the 20th century. Oil revenue transformed Saudi Arabia from a mostly rural tribal society into one of the wealthiest nations in the world within the span of 2 generations. The speed of that transformation is genuinely hard to overstate. Cities that had been small trading and pilgrimage towns turned into sprawling modern metropolises within a few decades, connected by highways, airports, and telecommunications infrastructure built almost entirely on oil revenue. Saudi Arabia became a founding member of OPEC in 1960, and by the 1970s, oil price shocks had turned the kingdom into one of the most financially consequential single actors in the entire global economy, capable of moving oil markets and, by extension, entire national economies elsewhere, with production decisions made in Riyadh. For decades, that oil wealth coexisted with a famously conservative social order: strict guardianship laws, a ban on women driving, no public cinemas, and gender-segregated public life enforced by religious authorities. That is the version of Saudi Arabia most people still carry in their heads, and for a long time, it was an accurate one. But here is the pivot, because the picture on the ground has genuinely moved. Since 2016, under the Vision 2030 reform program championed by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia has pushed through changes that would have been almost unthinkable a decade earlier. Women were granted the right to drive in 2018. The religious police lost much of their public enforcement authority. Cinemas reopened for the first time in over 35 years. Mixed gender concerts, sporting events, and festivals now draw large crowds in cities that had almost no public entertainment sector before. Female labor force participation has climbed sharply, moving from a small fraction of the workforce toward roughly a third of it in just a few years. These changes are real, and they are also by design controlled from the top down rather than the product of grassroots political liberalization. Saudi Arabia remains an absolute monarchy with no elected national legislature, and criticism of the government or royal family still carries serious legal risk. The reforms have loosened social rules dramatically while leaving the underlying political structure essentially untouched, and understanding modern Saudi Arabia means holding both of those facts at once. Underneath the headline reforms, everyday culture still runs on rhythms that predate the modern state by centuries. Hospitality remains close to sacred, offering guests dates, Arabic coffee poured from a distinctive long-spouted pot, and unhurried conversation is a genuine social obligation, not a tourist performance staged for cameras. Family and tribal identity still carry enormous social weight even in the most modern Saudi households, and the 5 daily prayer times still visibly shape the rhythm of the working day in a way few outsiders fully register until they have actually spent time in the country. Shops pausing briefly, conversations pausing, entire malls going quiet for a few minutes at a time, several times a day. Let's talk numbers, because Vision 2030 only makes sense with real figures attached. Saudi Arabia's GDP sits at roughly $1.1 trillion, making it the largest economy in the Arab world by a wide margin, larger than the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait combined. GDP per capita lands around $30,000 in nominal terms. Non-oil activity now accounts for a majority of real GDP, a genuine milestone for a country that spent most of the last century defined almost entirely by petroleum exports. At the center of the diversification push sits the Public Investment Fund, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, managing well over $1 trillion in assets and functioning as the primary financing engine behind the country's giga-projects, including Neom, a futuristic development zone in the northwest that includes the Line, a proposed linear city stretching over 100 kilometers through the desert, an idea so architecturally unconventional that even industry engineers remain divided on how much of it will be built as originally announced. Unemployment among Saudi nationals has fallen substantially in recent years, though it remains higher than the headline national rate once the large expatriate workforce is factored out of the calculation. The Public Investment Fund's reach extends well beyond desert megaprojects. It holds stakes in global companies, has bankrolled a professional golf league merger, funded major stakes in video game publishers, and backs a domestic football league that has spent heavily to attract some of the sport's biggest international names. All part of a deliberate strategy to build soft power and diversify national income streams simultaneously. Critics have pointed to some of these investments, particularly in global sports, as an attempt to improve the country's international image alongside its economy, a strategy widely referred to as sports washing by human rights organizations. Supporters within the kingdom frame the same spending as smart economic diversification and a legitimate play for cultural relevance on the world stage. Both framings get argued in the same breath depending on who you ask. If you have made it this far and you are enjoying the journey, a like and a subscribe genuinely help. Religious tourism remains a massive and often underappreciated part of the Saudi economy. Millions of Muslims travel to Mecca each year for the Hajj pilgrimage, a religious obligation for able-bodied Muslims who can afford the journey, alongside tens of millions more who complete the smaller Umrah pilgrimage throughout the rest of the year. Managing that scale of pilgrimage, housing, transporting, and safely moving crowds that can exceed 1 million people during peak Hajj days has turned Mecca and Medina into some of the most intensively engineered urban environments anywhere on Earth, purpose-built around crowd flow and religious ritual rather than conventional city planning. The logistics behind that engineering are staggering once you actually break them down. High-speed rail lines connect the holy sites to nearby cities specifically to move pilgrims efficiently. Vast temporary tent cities, some of them air-conditioned and semi-permanent, spring up around Mecca during peak pilgrimage season to house crowds larger than the population of most countries, all coordinated by a government ministry whose entire purpose is managing this single annual event safely. Heat remains the single most serious risk factor during Hajj, since the pilgrimage follows the lunar Islamic calendar and can fall during the punishing peak of summer roughly once every 3 decades. A scheduling reality that has, in past cycles, contributed to serious heat-related casualties among elderly or vulnerable pilgrims, and one the government has invested heavily in mitigating through shaded walkways, misting stations, and expanded medical infrastructure. Beyond religious tourism, Saudi Arabia only began issuing tourist visas to the general public in 2019, a genuinely recent shift for a country that had spent decades restricting entry almost entirely to pilgrims, workers, and business travelers. Since then, the government has poured resources into building out leisure tourism from close to nothing, betting that historical sites, Red Sea resorts, and desert landscapes can eventually rival oil and religious travel as pillars of the economy. No honest account of the Vision 2030 transformation can skip its harder edges. Labor conditions for the country's millions of foreign workers remain a persistent point of international scrutiny, particularly around the kafala-style sponsorship system that has historically tied a worker's legal status to their employer. Though Saudi Arabia has introduced labor reforms in recent years aimed at giving workers more freedom to change jobs, political and press freedoms remain tightly restricted, and the country's human rights record, including its use of the death penalty and treatment of dissidents, continues to draw criticism from international rights organizations. The war in neighboring Yemen, in which Saudi Arabia has played a leading military role since 2015, has also drawn sustained international attention and humanitarian concern. The reform story and the criticism exist side by side, and neither one cancels the other out. Saudi Arabia is genuinely opening up in ways that were unimaginable a decade ago, while genuinely remaining one of the more tightly controlled political systems in the region. You would not expect a country this associated with flat desert to hold much in the way of dramatic landscape, and yet parts of it genuinely surprise. Alula in the northwest is home to Hegra, Saudi Arabia's first UNESCO World Heritage Site, a Nabatean city of monumental tombs carved directly into sandstone cliffs, built by the same civilization responsible for Petra in neighboring Jordan, and left largely unexcavated and unvisited by the outside world until only the last few years. The Red Sea coastline holds coral reefs and marine life that rival better-known diving destinations, now being developed into high-end resort projects as part of the tourism push. And the Empty Quarter, one of the largest continuous sand deserts on the planet, stretches across the southeastern part of the country in dune fields that shift and reshape themselves with the wind. a landscape almost entirely untouched by the modernization happening in the cities a few hundred kilometers away. The southwestern Asir region breaks the desert stereotype almost completely, with mountain terraces, cooler highland temperatures, and traditional stone and mud brick villages that look more like something from the Himalayas than the Arabian Peninsula most people picture. Terraced agriculture has been practiced on those slopes for centuries, and the region's cultural traditions, from architecture to dress to festival customs, remain distinct enough from the rest of the country that many Saudis themselves consider Asir something of a hidden gem within their own borders. For anyone actually planning to visit, Riyadh is the obvious starting point for modern Saudi Arabia, with its rapidly changing skyline, the historic Diriyah district, birthplace of the Saudi state, now restored into a major heritage and dining destination, and the National Museum offering a fast crash course in the country's history. Jeddah's Old Town, Al-Balad, is a UNESCO-listed maze of coral stone buildings and wooden latticework balconies that predates the oil era by centuries. Ailula is worth dedicating real time to, both for Hegra and for the dramatic sandstone landscape surrounding it. Non-Muslim visitors should note that Mecca and Medina's holiest sites remain restricted to Muslims only, a firm rule rather than a formality. Tourist e-visas, available since 2019, have made entry dramatically simpler than it was for most of the country's modern history, and the cooler months from November through March remain the most comfortable window for most of the country outside the Red Sea coast. Saudi Arabia, unified into a single modern state less than a century ago, discovered oil just a few years later, and has spent the decades since transforming from a mostly tribal desert society into one of the wealthiest and most consequential countries in the world. And it is right now in the middle of trying to do that transformation a second time, betting an entire national fund on cities, tourism, and industries that have nothing to do with oil at all. It's a country that is genuinely ancient in its religious and cultural roots and genuinely brand new in its modern state structure, genuinely opening up and genuinely still tightly controlled, genuinely staking its future on becoming something the rest of the world has never quite seen a Gulf nation attempt at this scale before. Maybe the real question isn't whether Saudi Arabia is what you pictured. It's whether the picture most people are still carrying around was ever going to stay accurate for very long. If you learned something here, that's what this channel is for. Like the video, drop a comment with what surprised you most, and subscribe if you want more of these deep dives. There's a lot more of the world left to get wrong about.